On this special edition of The Heat, we go one-on-one with two top United Nations officials. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. The United Nations General Assembly is well underway in New York as world leaders gather to discuss some of the most pressing global issues. Climate change, food security, education, and the Russia-Ukraine crisis are all on the agenda, among other issues. Later, we'll speak with Amina Mohammed, chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group. But first, our interview with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. My colleague Deji Xu spoke with him about the challenges the UN faces right now. Let's watch.
Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. First, thank you very much for taking your time and accept our interview.
It's a great pleasure.
First, I'll start with your recent trip to Pakistan. You saw the catastrophe by flood in your own very eyes, and you said there that Pakistan has not contributed in a meaningful way to climate change, yet Pakistan is one of the most dramatically impacted countries by climate change. Do you think that industrialized countries, especially developed countries, they have done enough to mitigate the climate change? And what do you expect them to do except making promises?
I would say that almost nobody has done enough. Developed countries have an historical responsibility for the many decades in the past in which they were the main emitters. Today we have emerging economies that are also very relevant big emitters, and we need to guarantee two things. First is that developed countries reduce quickly their emissions, and second, that they cooperate with the emerging economies and other developing countries with finance, with technology, with support, in order to allow them to accelerate also the green transition of their economies that they cannot do by themselves because they came later in the development process. So there is an essential question here. Developed countries have promised $100 billion per year in 2020. We are in 2022, it has not yet happened. And this is just a drop in the ocean. I mean, we also need a stronger engagement of international financial institutions in climate action, in support of developing countries, and leveraging private finance to support developing countries on this. Then look at Pakistan, the devastation that took place. Obviously, you cannot avoid a situation like that, but you can, to a large extent, control it better if you have massively invested in what is called adaptation, in building resilience, in having resilient infrastructure. I mean, just a simple thing. The roads that had been built higher resisted. The roads that have been built at a lower level were destroyed, which means investments need to be made, namely in the countries that are more impacted by climate change, to protect those countries from the impact, the devastating impact of climate change. But that requires investment, and that requires knowledge and technology. And these developed countries need to provide. There was a promise of $40 billion per year in Glasgow. We'll see whether the promise will be met or not, but it's not enough. Developing countries need about $300 billion per year to invest in adaptation, in resilience, to protect their societies. And then there is loss and damage. Loss and damage is in the Paris Agreement, but until now there has not been a serious discussion and a serious mechanism of action to put it seriously on the table. So I hope that in Cairo, finally, it will be possible to have serious discussions and action on loss and damage.
A year ago, the Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed Global Development Initiative here in UNGA 76 to promote people's well-being. How do you think this Global Development Initiative could help achieve the SDGs?
It was exactly launched to support the implementation of the SDGs. And obviously, any initiative aiming at overcoming that gap that exists is extremely welcome. There will be, by the way, during this week, a meeting of the group of friends of the initiative. I will send a message and we will be fully represented. And this initiative and others that other countries might be able to put on the table will be very much welcome, because we need to rescue the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is exactly the objective of the Global Development Initiative.
Since 1980s, you've been traveled to China many times. How would you describe the major change in China, and do you think that would the development story would benefit the global community?
No, I think that the most important change, I think there are many changes in many aspects, and there are even aspects in which we might disagree, but there is one thing that is true, and that is absolutely remarkable. Poverty is something that we should eradicate in the world. And China was able to eradicate extreme poverty in 2020 and has brought to the middle class hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Now, this change is a very important change, and it had also an enormous impact in the global welfare indicators. So if I had to choose one thing that I've seen the change, the first time I was in China was in 84, probably.
84, yes.
84, the first time. I remember being in Guangdong, and there was a bridge, and at sunset there were, I would say, millions of bicycles crossing. There were no cars, and the city, showed the poverty of the people. If we go there now, we see a completely different picture, and that is something that needs recognition.
We know that different countries have different developing models, but do you think China's development story can give some inspirations to some of the developing countries?
As you said, different countries have different models. There are different cultures, different approaches to work, to the life in society, even visions about human rights, about welfare. So different countries have, indeed, different ways. But we should be able to look into what are the aspects of this development model that can be applied in other societies and take profit of it.
Okay, now we're going to discuss something about the challenges the UN faces now.
If I may, that is exactly the logic of the so-called South-South cooperation.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the challenges now the United Nations face. For some developed countries, the United Nations is vitally important. Yet with geopolitical tensions rising nowadays, some feel some issues like humanitarian assistance, human rights, they could be politicized. And how can the UN keep its objectivity to show all the member states, especially developing countries, that they can rely on the United Nations for its support and justice?
Now, the United Nations is committed to all aspects of its agenda. The peace and security aspects, the sustainable development aspects, including climate, the humanitarian aid, and the human rights. And of course, the first thing that is important when we talk about human rights and humanitarian aid is that human rights are respected and humanitarian aid is provided. So there is always a risk of politicizing, but that risk should not be a pretext not to respect human rights or not to distribute humanitarian aid. And so my appeal is for the international community to be able, without other objectives, but the real value of these things to invest in humanitarian aid and to invest in human rights.
And another issue I think the UN faces nowadays is, many people think that the UN now is facing a crisis of confidence, that it cannot play some key role in many critical issues. What's your response?
I think there is a crisis of confidence, but that is a more generalized crisis of confidence and trust in the societies in general and in the international community. But when people talk about it, they are mainly thinking about the Security Council, where the geopolitical divides do not allow to have a common position in relation to some of the most complex crises that we face at the present moment. But if you look at the UN as a whole, I mean, half of the humanitarian assistance, international humanitarian assistance in the world is distributed through the UN. I mean, without the World Food Programme, can you imagine what would happen in the world? I mean, the role of UNICEF or the International Agency for Migration or the Refugee Agency that I was myself in charge of. I mean, I remember the millions of people we have helped in the most desperate situations. So we need to see the UN in its entirety. The UN that is supporting countries in development, the UN that is the greater promoter of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, of justice in relation to developing countries, the UN that represents with its peacekeeping, and China is very much involved in peacekeeping, the protection of civilians in the most difficult situations, sometimes with the peacekeepers themselves being killed and sacrificing their lives for the protection of others. So I think that if one looks at the confidence indicators that there are, all these surveys that are made, I feel that the UN is still respected by the majority of the people in the world. There is a problem that is difficult to solve, which is the fact that we have a geopolitical divide that impacts on the UN and impacts in many other things.
One last question. 6 years ago,
and we need one world, not several.
One last question, Secretary General. 6 years ago, when you were elected Secretary General, you talked to my colleague in Beijing. You said that Secretary General of the United Nations has to be a fighter, and at the same time, it's an impossible job. Now, after 6 years in office, do you consider yourself a fighter, and what you learned from this impossible job?
Well, I learned that, first of all, contrary to what many people think, discreet diplomacy is still more effective than megaphone diplomacy. Most of the agreements that we have been able to reach, we have done it very quietly. The grain agreement that everybody considers quite an achievement, it was done with months of negotiations, very discreetly, until we finally got to a solution. So I more and more, the more confusion there is in the global public opinions with all these social medias and things of the sort, the more I believe that there is still a space for discreet diplomacy, provided that diplomacy is not biased, provided that diplomacy is based on impartiality, as it is the case of the United Nations. And the second thing I've learned is that you cannot solve all the problems of the world. But if you are able to rescue one person from hunger and famine, if you are able to avoid someone else to be killed or an innocent man to be jailed, that is very important. And that is what makes our heart feeling that what we are doing makes sense.
Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, thank you very much.
All the best. Thank you very much. Xie xie.
That was my colleague Daisy Xu speaking with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. A key part of this year's assembly is refocusing on the United Nations' 17 Sustainable Development Goals and accomplishing them by 2030. CGTN's Elaine Reyes sat down with Amina Mohammed, who is also the chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
After you joined the United Nations in 2012, you played a key role in the process that led to the global agreement around the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as the creation of the SDG Sustainable Development Goals. So what is your status assessment of where those goals are right now?
Well, first of all, it took such a long time to get there. It was a process that gave birth to an odd number of goals, but all that represented the key challenges, but also the opportunities that we had. And there was a paradigm shift to say that it would be about sustainability, the economy, the environment, and the social agenda, all wrapped into one, the DNA, if you would. And I think that what has happened is that we've had a greater understanding of how important that is over the last few years, halfway through. What is perhaps not such good news is that we've not made the progress we thought we could. It's a heavy lift. It's been exacerbated by a number of crises that we knew would come if we didn't make the investments we needed in climate action, if we didn't deal with the issues of poverty, and put a lot more financing into health. Perhaps we wouldn't have had the pandemic. So it's shown us that investing in sustainable development is the way forward, that we are off track, but that we can get back on track, that there are opportunities in many transitions that can happen for energy, for food systems, for the digital space. So I'm very hopeful, but clearly we have a big lift and it can only be done together. It can only be done when we all join hands and move forward.
Well, as we speak right now, everywhere we look, it seems countries are being ravaged by the effects of climate change. What have you personally seen over the years in your time in your home country of Nigeria, and as you've traveled throughout the world over the years for the United Nations?
I mean, incredible situations in my country, for instance. I've seen Lake Chad dry up to about 10% of what it should be and was, and that's huge because that's lots of livelihoods lost. It used to be a huge fishing community that didn't only provide for the country but exported within Africa. So those livelihoods, especially for women, young people. I've seen how climate action has undermined and exacerbated conflict situations where we've lost land, where population has grown, and so therefore the conflicts between herders and farmers have increased. I've seen pollution where we have been using fossil fuels that we would like to move away from into renewables that have been exacerbated by militancy. So that in its first, up close and personal as my country. But I've also seen that as I go around the world, the melting glaciers. I was in Central Asia not long ago, and the dynamics there are huge, that these emissions are having a difference. And not only did I witness them just a few weeks ago, but then to see what happened in Pakistan, and that a third of the country would be underwater, and that you would be saying, what are we going to do now? The science is clear, the evidence is there, people's lives and livelihoods are lost. This must move us to action and delivering on the promises of the Paris Agreement.
Well, to back end on that, you said recently, and I want to quote, "We have to rescue SDGs now and accelerate action to achieve the goals by 2030. How concerned are you that nations are still not taking this seriously, and what is the UN doing to push these countries for more cooperation and for more financial support?
Well, I think we have to keep our voices loud, both within the UN, but also within civil society and partners that we have on the ground, and we work on the ground in over 170 countries as the UN. I think we have to convene more around these issues as we do now, and to really begin to narrow where the bottlenecks are, where is the leadership not stepping up to the plate, and to call them to the table to step up. And to show how many of these solutions can happen. It's not for want of resources, but what is it that will actually move the actions we need to open up the fiscal space, for instance, for more resources for our renewable transitions or for connecting people better in a digital way. And I think that that's what we do here. The general debate that will happen in the United Nations next week will call on education, it will call on the climate action, it will call on the horrible impact that goes way beyond Ukraine to the rest of the world because of the war there. So it's the opportunities to continue to convene and to try to convince people that it is better in everyone's interest if we act now.
You began your career in schools and in clinics in Nigeria. Your heart is in education, and you've advocated for increasing access to education. Couple of questions here. The African continent is full of young people, and some predict that it will be home to 25% of the world's population by 2050. So when it comes to sustainability, how key is education, and what are the challenges ahead?
Well, I mean, education cannot be without the investments that are needed, and those investments are considerable. It's not a small amount that goes into it, but it is the best investment that you can make in an individual, in a community, a society, in a country. I think that leaders in Africa now, when they look at their obligation to the security of their citizens and they grapple with that in trying to make a more enabling and secure environment, their second obligation and right for our people is an education. Without that, we will not have the right skill sets for the economies that we want to grow. We will have many people excluded, and that will begin to be the root causes for social unrest, exclusion, a lack of hope or belief in a country, and a loss of trust in institutions and in government. So there are many things we lose and so much that we gain. What we haven't been able to do is to make the case as well as we can, and to find ways of seeing the investments for all those very basic rights that we need to health, to education, to water and sanitation. Many tensions there, and often countries don't have the resources to do all of it, which they should as a basic minimum. So for Africa, this is I think, a huge challenge to get global solidarity, to do that, but also to find ways ourselves of moving forward. I'm a beneficiary of an amazing education in Africa. And I think that, you know, the demand on the education systems, institutions has grown. We need more investments to address them. Teachers, schools, technology, big demands. But again, this is the promise of the SDGs.
So what do you hope to convey during the General Assembly? And what do you hope is taken away from what you were trying to present regarding education?
My hope is that we continue to recognize the value of multilateralism, and that coming into this space is about our global town hall for the global village. Everyone has a voice. May not be equal, but you have a voice. And to have it heard on the pulpit, some of those problems could be resolved. Others may need to wait to another couple of debates, but at least you're heard, and at least there is hope that with that voice come the solutions, with that voice comes the solidarity that we so badly need today.
Deputy Secretary General, Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality, pardon me. It's a subject that has gotten a lot of attention recently, especially with what has happened in Afghanistan, but it is a global issue. So how can we make progress in countries that are still resistant to the idea of gender equality and women's rights?
I think don't address gender equality ad hoc. Make it a part of the whole discussion. So if I'm going to sit in front of the Taliban and have a discussion on their economy, I need to show them that 50% of their population has to be involved in that for them to fly on 2 wings. So an integral part of every discussion you have has to acknowledge that you have a community, you have people that are women, that are girls, and they have equal rights. And when those are attained, the country's better off for it. So it's not a fight about what is right or wrong. It is and should be that those rights will see themselves at the center of everything that a country does. Now, some people are traveling a journey that they're very far from where we would like to see them. I don't believe in pressing the fast forward button, because I think what we do is that we end up coming back to where we were before if there's not ownership. And so engaging with governments that are way off track, that have no idea what those obligations and rights are about, is bringing them along. And that's tough, because we speak totally different languages when it comes to women's rights. And so we need the international community, we need civil society, we need businesses, we need those that will say, if we're going to take 2 steps forward, one of those steps has to be for women. And I think that that's the engagement that we need. It's clearly we know what is wrong, and we know what we need to do to get it right. It is the narrative, the language, the communication, the way we do it, to make sure that it is an understanding of 2 parties to agree to go in the same direction. In the case of Afghanistan, this is about every girl in school, every woman entitled to earn and to look at her aspirations as anyone else would. And I hope that, you know, that Afghanistan could lead, and then maybe the rest of the world would see that anything is possible.
I'd like to turn to SDG goal number 1, no poverty. China, as you know, has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But given the current global environment, with so many people suffering with the pandemic, the effects of geopolitics, inflation, can the China model be replicated? Is that something that can be done with so many developing countries still trying to get their people out of poverty?
Well, I mean, it was amazing what China was able to do, because that's actually how the goal for poverty on the MDGs was achieved, was the efforts that came out of China. I think China has many examples of how this could work. Not every country would be able to achieve those goals in the same way. So I think there are lessons learned, and many could gain from that. And I think what the UN tries to do is to share those best practices around the world, around the framing of what we've got to get done as goal number 1 of the SDGs. So yes, lessons learned, and in particular, you know, what were those key ingredients to taking people out of poverty? Education was one. Putting a square, nutritious meal on the table was another. So there are things that we can all do, and that were examples of what helped China pull people out of poverty. And I think the biggest lesson we have to learn is how you did it at scale. And that's a big one. It's not to do a few people, it's to do everyone above the poverty line and giving them an opportunity.
I'd like to get your reflections on all of the goals after all that has happened in recent years, as we mentioned, the global pandemic, a worsening climate crisis, massive inflation, the geopolitics as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think that the Sustainable Development Goals need to be revised in any way? Are they too ambitious at this point?
Well, we never limit ambition to the human circumstance, and today it's not in a very good place. And the SDGs are ambitious, but they're just what we need. It is still the framing around which the world comes together to hope and to move in a direction that we can achieve them. I think what is beautiful about sustainable development is that today it's 17 goals, in 2030 it may be 8 or it may be 10. What is important is not to fail before you get to 2030. Keep plugging away, making the investments, making your voices heard where leaders are concerned, to get the right things done for it. So I'm very hopeful halfway through the SDGs. We could pivot, we could find the opportunities, as they say, the silver lining in the dark cloud of COVID or Ukraine or climate crisis, to move the next 7 years to 2030 with a lot of successes. So no giving up, no. This is not a time to reset. This is a time to put more wind under the wings of the SDGs. And in the UN, we're always innovating. The Secretary General in his second term has presented our common agenda. Member states have interrogated it. They have given us marching orders, and that, I think, will be additional support for us to accelerate getting to the 2030 agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals.
Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we need to leave it there. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching this special edition of The Heat.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you all around the world.